A simple farmer lived quietly on his land until he found a huge hole right in the middle of his field. Curiosity proved stronger than fear, and he decided to climb down into it. But what he saw in the depths left him speechless and shook the whole world. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The life of Thomas Brooks had never been extraordinary. His days passed slowly, measured by the rhythm of the land he owned, a stretch of rolling pastures dotted with cows and enclosed by tired wooden fences that had seen more years than most men in the county. His farm sat on the edge of nowhere, a cluster of old barns and sheds with a weather-beaten house standing at the center like a monument to persistence. He was a man of the soil, a farmer in every sense, his skin darkened by sun and labor, his hands thick and calloused, his shoulders stooped from years of toil. People in the nearby town knew him as quiet, stubborn, dependable, someone who never left his land for long because the land itself was the only family he still had. His wife had passed away years ago. His children had moved to cities, searching for lives beyond fields and fences. He had stayed. The farm was his anchor, his burden, and his pride. Every morning he rose before dawn, drank a cup of bitter black coffee, and stepped out into the early chill to check on the animals. The cows greeted him with heavy breathing and the sound of hooves sinking into the wet grass. Birds circled above, their cries cutting through the stillness of the hills. On some mornings, when the fog clung low to the ground, Thomas thought the land looked like it was floating on water, a solitary island of pasture in a sea of gray mist. It was, on one such morning, that something unusual caught his attention. One of the cows had wandered to the farthest corner of the pasture, a place where the grass grew wild and thick and where Thomas rarely went. Instead of grazing, the animal stood nervously at a distance, stamping its hooves and swinging its head from side to side. Curious, Thomas walked closer, pushing through tall weeds until he reached the edge of a clearing. That was when he saw it. At first glance, he thought it was simply a sinkhole, a collapse in the earth caused by rain and erosion. The ground had given way, forming a large hollow in the soil. But as he stepped closer, he realized this was something different. The hole was vast, circular, its edges uneven and raw, as though torn apart by unseen hands. He crouched, peering into the darkness below, but the blackness was absolute. No light reached the bottom. The hole seemed endless, a vertical throat in the earth that swallowed everything into silence. Thomas frowned and reached down, picking up a stone the size of his fist. He leaned forward carefully, feeling the ground shift slightly under his boots, and tossed the stone into the hole. He expected the satisfying clatter of rock against stone, the faint echo of its fall. Instead, there was nothing. The silence after the throw was so complete that it made his ears ache. He waited, holding his breath, but no sound ever returned. It was as though the hole had swallowed the stone into another world. He stood back, uneasy. The edges of the hole were fringed with roots from nearby trees, their long tendrils reaching into the void like skeletal fingers trying to cling to something unseen. The earth smelled damp, rich with the scent of rot and moisture. A faint draft of air rose from below, cool and moist against his face, carrying with it a sense of something ancient and hidden. All day he thought about what he had seen. He tried to work, feeding the cows, repairing a broken gate, cleaning the tools in the barn, but his mind returned again and again to the hole. When night fell and he sat alone at his wooden kitchen table, he could still feel it pulling at his thoughts. The image of the black opening hovered behind his eyes, unsettling, insistent. It was not just curiosity. It was something deeper, almost like a calling. The following morning he returned. The grass was damp with dew, and the edges of the hole glistened with wet soil. He brought another stone, this one larger, and threw it in. Again, silence. The absence of sound was more terrifying than any noise could have been. He picked up a branch, long and sturdy, and leaned into the hole, pushing it downward. The wood disappeared into the darkness, further and further, until his arms strained to hold it. He pulled it back out and found nothing unusual, only damp soil at the tip. But still, the question burned in him. How deep was it? By the third day, his curiosity had transformed into obsession. At night, he dreamed of falling, tumbling endlessly into blackness, with walls of rock rushing past him but never touching. He woke, drenched in sweat, the silence of the hole still ringing in his ears. He sat on the edge of his bed and asked himself why it mattered. He could have ignored it, filled the hole with dirt, fenced off the area, and gone on with his life. Yet he could not. Something inside him whispered that this was not an ordinary hole, that it was hiding something meant to be found. He tried to remember the stories told by old men when he was young. They had spoken of places in the earth where animals vanished, where the land seemed cursed. He recalled one tale about a cow that wandered off and was never seen again, about hunters who had disappeared while searching the woods. At the time, he had dismissed those stories as country superstitions, the kind of nonsense that old men told by firelight to scare children. Now, standing at the edge of the hole, he wondered if those tales had been born here on his own land. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands, staring into the void. He whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear him. "What are you?" His voice was swallowed immediately by the darkness, leaving nothing but silence. The wind stirred the weeds around him, but the hole itself remained motionless, patient, waiting. He backed away, but only far enough to feel safe, and stood there for a long time, unable to turn his back on it. The blackness at the bottom was not just an absence of light. It was an absence of everything. A void that seemed to deny existence itself. The thought chilled him, yet at the same time it drew him closer. When he finally left that day, walking back across the pasture with the sun sinking low behind the hills, he knew his life had already changed. He had seen something that could not be forgotten. The hole had taken root in his mind. It was no longer just a gap in the earth. It was a question, vast and unrelenting, and it demanded an answer. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the old wooden house creaked and sighed around him. The sound of the wind outside reminded him of the draft of air from the hole, cold and damp. He rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, but the unease would not leave. He thought of the silence, of the stone that had never landed, of the branch disappearing into the dark. His heart beat faster. He could see the blackness even with his eyes shut. By morning, his mind was made up. He could not ignore it. He would have to know what lay at the bottom, no matter how dangerous it might be. The farm had always been his world, but now the land was whispering of a larger truth hidden beneath his very feet. As he stepped out into the crisp dawn, his breath clouding in the cold, he turned his eyes once more toward the far edge of the pasture. The hole waited, silent and patient. Thomas Brooks knew he would return. In the days that followed, Thomas Brooks found himself consumed by a restlessness that he could not shake. The farm was still there. The animals still needed tending. The fences still sagged. The fields still demanded their share of labor. But every action felt hollow, as though it were performed by someone else, while his mind was occupied with the image of the dark opening at the far edge of his pasture. He tried to distract himself with work, fixing the hinges of the barn doors, oiling the old tractor that coughed and sputtered whenever he tried to start it, cleaning the tools that had gathered rust over the years, but even as his hands moved, his thoughts circled back to the hole. At night, he lay awake, staring into the darkness of his bedroom, and it was never simply darkness anymore. It was that darkness, the one that swallowed stones and branches and gave back nothing in return. In his dreams, he fell endlessly, the sensation of air rushing past his face, his arms flailing in vain to grasp something solid, but there was nothing to catch. He woke, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his throat dry, and he would sit on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands, whispering to himself that it was madness to think of going down there. But the very next day, he would find himself standing at the edge of the hole again, staring down as if the abyss itself had hooked him and was drawing him closer. On the third night, he could not take it any more. He lit a lamp in the kitchen and sat at the old wooden table, staring at his calloused hands as if they could answer the question tormenting him. He thought about the hole, about the silence, about the strange draft of cool, damp air that seemed to carry with it the scent of an untouched world. He realized with a sudden clarity that he would never have peace unless he discovered what lay beneath. He could not rely on others. He knew no one who would risk such a descent, and even if he did, the thought of letting strangers claim the discovery gnawed at him. This was on his land, his responsibility, his secret. He would be the one to go down. Once the decision settled in his chest, he felt a strange calm. The fear was still there, like a shadow clinging to his thoughts, but now it was joined by purpose. He began to plan. He would need ropes strong enough to support not only his weight, but the length of the descent. He would need harnesses, carabiners, lights that could cut through the suffocating black. He would need oxygen because the air down there might not be fit to breathe. He would need a way to record what he saw because no one would believe him otherwise. The next day, he drove into town, an uncommon act for him. He sold 2 of his cows, reluctant but resigned, and put an old piece of machinery up for scrap. With the money, he ordered climbing equipment from a supplier in the city. The young clerk who took his order raised an eyebrow, remarking that this was professional gear, the kind used for deep cave exploration, and asked if he had plans to travel. Thomas muttered something about fixing an old well and left it at that. He did not want anyone to know. When the packages arrived a week later, he opened them with the reverence of a man unwrapping sacred objects. There were coils of rope that gleamed with newness, metal carabiners that clinked sharply, harnesses padded and reinforced, helmets with mounts for powerful lamps, and a set of heavy-duty flashlights that promised hours of light in the deepest dark. There were oxygen tanks, smaller than those used by divers, but sufficient to sustain him in places where the air might fail. And there was a camera, a rugged device with night vision and a wide lens, capable of recording whatever lay hidden in the depths. He laid everything out on the floor of his living room, the equipment forming a circle around him, and for the first time in years he felt the tremor of excitement, a spark that cut through the monotony of his solitary existence. Yet beneath the excitement lurked dread. He was not a young man anymore, and though his body was strong from years of labor, it had not been trained for this. One slip, one mistake, and the hole would swallow him whole, leaving no trace behind. So he began to practice. He fixed a rope to the beam in his barn and spent hours learning to descend and ascend, his hands gripping the rope until blisters formed and bled, then calloused over again. He climbed the tall oak near the house, fastening himself with the harness and lowering himself down, then pulling himself back up, over and over until his muscles trembled with fatigue. He tested the oxygen mask, strapping it over his face, breathing in the artificial hiss of air, familiarizing himself with its weight. He strapped on the helmet, turned on the light, and walked through the darkened barn at night, forcing himself to grow accustomed to the narrow beam of vision. He checked and rechecked the knots, memorizing their feel even with his eyes shut. At times, he cursed himself for his stubbornness. He could have fenced the hole and forgotten it, as any sensible man would. But Thomas had never been the kind to turn away from a challenge. His land was his life, and if it held a secret, then it was his duty to uncover it. One evening, after another long day of practice, he sat down at his table and wrote a letter. The words did not come easily. He wrote that if he did not return, whoever found the letter should know that he had chosen this path willingly. He wrote that the farm should be sold to pay off what little debt remained, and that if there was anything left, it should go to his children, though he doubted they would care. He folded the letter and left it on the table, weighted by a glass jar so it would not be lost. The following days he focused on preparing his supplies for the journey. He packed food that would not spoil quickly, water in sturdy containers, spare batteries, coils of rope in case he needed to descend further than one length could manage. He tested the camera again and again, ensuring that it captured both sound and image, imagining the moment when he would finally reveal the truth of what lay hidden beneath his land. At night, he lay awake, his body aching from the day's labor, but his mind alive with images of the descent. The hole had become more than an opening in the ground. It was a challenge, a mystery, a test of will. And Thomas knew he was ready. When dawn broke one cold morning, he stood at the edge of the pasture again, looking at the dark mouth that had haunted his thoughts. The grass bent under the weight of dew, and the hole exhaled its familiar breath of cool, damp air. He felt fear rising in his chest, but alongside it was resolve. His preparations were complete. Soon he would know what waited in the silence below. The morning of his decision arrived with an eerie stillness, as though the world itself had paused to witness what he was about to do. The sun had not yet risen fully, and the hills lay draped in a gray light, their shapes blurred by mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. Thomas Brooks woke before dawn, his body heavy with the knowledge of what awaited him, yet driven by a determination that overpowered fatigue. He brewed a pot of coffee, strong and bitter, and drank it in silence at the kitchen table. His letter still lay there, a folded testament to his choice, the words he hoped no one would ever need to read. He left it untouched, the glass jar pressing it flat against the wood, and turned his thoughts to the task at hand. The gear was already packed, checked, and rechecked. Coils of rope lay neatly wound inside a canvas bag, the harness folded carefully, the helmet polished so the light would shine cleanly. The oxygen tank, small but essential, rested beside the ropes, its metal surface cold to the touch. The camera was secured in a padded case, its lens gleaming faintly, a silent promise that whatever he found would not be lost to memory alone. He carried everything out to the edge of the pasture, his boots crunching against the frost-stiffened grass, and laid it beside the dark mouth of the hole. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing heavily, the cool draft from the depths brushing against his face. The air smelled faintly of stone and water, a mineral scent that stirred both dread and fascination. He thought of the weeks of preparation, of the blisters on his hands from practicing with the ropes, of the night spent staring into the darkness with his heart racing. All of it had led to this moment. He adjusted the harness around his waist, clipped the carabiners into place, and tied the first rope to a sturdy oak that leaned close to the edge. He tested the knot with deliberate care, pulling hard until he was satisfied that it would not give way. The hole gaped silently before him, waiting. Thomas put on the helmet, switched on the light, and the beam pierced the dark only for a few feet before dissolving into nothingness. He inhaled deeply, steadied his nerves, and clipped himself onto the rope. With a slow movement, he stepped backward, boots finding the crumbling edge of the earth, and then he lowered himself down. The first few meters were the easiest. The walls of the hole were rough with soil and stone, roots jutting out like broken bones, giving the illusion of support. His light illuminated the damp surfaces, beads of moisture shining like tiny stars before dripping downward into silence. He descended carefully, hand over hand, his body swaying slightly with each movement. The air grew cooler, denser, wrapping around him in a way that made him feel he was already entering another world. The sounds of the farm faded quickly. The distant lowing of cows, the rustle of the grass in the breeze, even the faint chirp of morning birds, all of it vanished above him as he sank deeper. In its place came only the sound of his breathing, harsh and mechanical, the rasp of the rope sliding through the descender, the occasional clatter of stone as his boot dislodged a fragment from the wall. Once, a rock broke free and tumbled past him into the void. He froze, listening, waiting for the sound of impact. None came. The silence below remained absolute, a silence so total it made his skin prickle. The light from above shrank until it was little more than a pale circle, a memory of the surface world. Thomas glanced upward, his neck aching from the angle, and felt a pang of loneliness more profound than any he had known before. He was alone now, suspended between earth and abyss, and there would be no one to save him if the rope failed. The thought pressed on him heavily, but he forced himself downward, clenching his jaw until the tension in his face ached. As he descended further, the texture of the walls changed. The soil gave way to solid stone, slick and cold beneath his gloves. Strange mineral patterns glimmered faintly in the beam of his lamp, streaks of quartz and veins of darker rock that seemed to twist and coil as though alive. He paused to touch them, feeling the cool dampness beneath his fingers, and then continued. The air thickened as he went deeper, humid and heavy, carrying with it the distant scent of something organic, as if there were living things hidden far below. Time became impossible to measure. Minutes stretched like hours, each movement of his hands and feet mechanical, deliberate, monotonous. His shoulders burned, his thighs trembled from the strain, but he pressed on. Fear came in waves, crashing against him when he dared to imagine how far he had yet to go, how impossible the return climb might be. He fought it by focusing only on the next handhold, the next careful step, downward, always downward. Then came the first real moment of panic. His boot slipped on a wet patch of stone, and his body swung suddenly away from the wall. The rope groaned under his weight, the harness bit into his hips, and for a breathless instant he was dangling in open air, his light spinning wildly. He gasped, clutching the rope with both hands, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. He hung there, trembling, before slowly regaining control. He pressed himself back toward the wall, forcing calm into his breathing, and cursed under his breath. The abyss had almost claimed him already, and he had barely begun. Yet, even in that moment, He could not consider turning back. The thought of retreating, of climbing all the way up only to leave the question unanswered, was unbearable. He gathered his strength and resumed the descent, his movements slower, more cautious, but filled with renewed determination. The fear had not left him, it never would, but it had become part of the rhythm, an undercurrent to each step downward. As he descended deeper still, the walls of the shaft began to open slightly, widening into a space larger than the narrow throat he had first entered. His lamp revealed a cavernous expanse, its walls glistening with moisture, streaked with mineral formations that glittered like veins of precious metal. The air grew warmer here, the humidity clinging to his skin, and he thought he heard faint echoes, distant drips of water falling into unseen pools below. The silence was no longer absolute. The earth was speaking in hushed tones, whispering of what lay further down. He paused again, dangling in the half-darkness, his body aching, and looked below. The beam of his light reached only so far before dissolving into endless black, but for the first time he felt the suggestion of space, of a world opening beneath him. It filled him with awe and terror in equal measure. Somewhere below, the ground waited, but it was not the ground he had known all his life. It was something different, something hidden. Thomas Brooks tightened his grip on the rope, adjusted his harness, and continued downward into the darkness, his breath steady, his heart wild, every nerve in his body alive with anticipation. He knew he was approaching the threshold of discovery, though he could not yet imagine what waited for him in the depths. And still he went on. The rope creaked faintly under his weight as Thomas Brooks lowered himself deeper into the widening shaft. His arms and legs trembled from the long descent, and the harness pressed into his hips with a bruising persistence, but he forced himself to keep moving downward. Every breath echoed in his helmet, every exhale sounding too loud in the silence. His lamp swung gently with his movements, casting arcs of light against the slick rock and the strange mineral patterns that had grown more intricate the farther he went. It was as though the walls themselves were changing, no longer rough and broken, but smoother, almost deliberate in their shapes, like the surface of some ancient structure molded by time. Minutes bled into hours, though Thomas could no longer be certain of how much time had truly passed. His mind existed only in the rhythm of descent. Grip the rope, loosen the device, ease downward, steady the swing, grip again. He knew that at any moment his strength might falter, that he could slip, and that the abyss would claim him without mercy. And yet, he pressed on. Something beyond fear kept him moving, something more powerful than doubt. It was the gnawing need to know, to see what no other eyes had seen, to uncover what the earth had hidden so completely. Then, suddenly, his boot scraped against something solid. At first, he thought it was another ledge, a protrusion of rock, but when his feet settled and his body stopped swinging, he realized he had reached a kind of shelf. He unhooked himself from the rope with shaking hands and stepped carefully onto the surface. The ground beneath him was stone, damp and uneven, but wide enough to stand. He turned slowly, the beam of his lamp sweeping outward, and the world opened. He had not expected it, could not have prepared for it, but there it was before him, a vast cavern stretching beyond the reach of his light. The narrow shaft through which he had descended had been only a throat leading into a body far greater, and now he stood on the edge of something that defied comprehension. The air was different here, warmer and thicker, filled with a moist heaviness that clung to his skin. A faint breeze touched his face, the first real movement of air he had felt since leaving the surface, carrying with it a smell both earthy and sweet, like damp leaves after rain. Thomas raised the lamp higher, and its beam caught the glint of water far below, a shimmering surface that reflected fragments of light like broken glass. The cavern seemed to hold a lake, still and vast, its edges lost in the shadows. Around it rose shapes that at first he thought were mere formations of rock, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized they were something more. Pillars, columns, ridges, structures that bore the rough outlines of trees. He blinked, disbelieving, and stepped closer to the edge of the ledge. The lamp's beam traveled further, and now he saw it clearly. There was growth down here. Not the barren walls of stone he had expected, but life. Mosses that glowed faintly in the dark, carpets of lichen spread across the cavern floor, tall grasses that swayed slightly in the unseen current of air. Further still, towering above the ground, were trees, their trunks pale and smooth, their branches heavy with leaves that shimmered as though coated with dew. A forest hidden deep beneath the earth. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He tore the camera from his pack and switched it on, the lens capturing the impossible side. He could hardly breathe, though whether from the weight of the air or the sheer wonder of what he was seeing, he could not tell. He had come expecting stone, perhaps old shafts, maybe even nothing at all, but this was beyond imagination. This was an entire world, sealed away in darkness, living without the touch of human hands. As he stood there in stunned silence, movement caught his eye. At first, it was only a shadow at the edge of the trees, a shape sliding silently between the trunks. He swung his lamp toward it, and the beam illuminated a creature unlike any he had seen before. It was a bird, or something like a bird, with wings that spread wider than his own arms, feathers shimmering faintly in the light. It turned its head, its eyes catching the beam for a brief second before it lifted into the air with a slow, deliberate grace. The sound of its wings filled the cavern, a deep thrumming that echoed against the stone, and then it was gone, vanishing into the forest below. Thomas staggered backward, his mind reeling. He had just seen something that should not exist, something that every book, every record would have told him was long extinct. Yet here it was, alive and real, flying through a forest hidden beneath the ground. He laughed, a breathless, incredulous sound, and then quickly silenced himself, the weight of the moment pressing down again. He scanned the cavern further, his lamp revealing more details with each sweep. In the distance he saw movement among the tall grasses, the unmistakable shapes of animals grazing, their silhouettes bulky and strange. Their forms suggested creatures of another time, with antlers that branched like trees and bodies larger than any deer he had ever seen. The sight made his skin prickle. These were no ordinary animals. They were survivors of a past the world believed gone forever. The realization struck him with the force of a hammer. He was standing on the threshold of a place that no human had ever touched. This was not just a cavern. It was a sanctuary, a hidden biome, preserved through millennia by the earth itself. Here, life had continued without interruption, evolving in secrecy, untouched by destruction, industry, or greed. He turned the camera back on himself, whispering into it as though speaking to the world above. His voice was shaky, trembling with awe. He described what he was seeing, the forest, the water, the animals. Yet, even as he spoke, a new thought crept into his mind, chilling him more than the abyss had ever done. If the world above learned of this place, what would become of it? He knew the answer as soon as he asked the question. Scientists would descend with their tools and their cages, governments would stake their claims, Corporations would see profit in every leaf and creature. Tourists would demand access, and roads would be carved into the earth to bring them. What was untouched now would be dissected, catalogued, destroyed. The purity of this place, its silence and secrecy, would vanish the moment he revealed it. The thought made him falter. He turned off the camera and lowered it, staring into the cavern with a heavy heart. The beauty before him was almost unbearable, not only because it was wondrous, but because he knew how fragile it was. A single voice, his voice, could end it all. He stood there for a long time, torn between elation and dread, unable to move. His lamp flickered slightly as the battery strained, casting shadows across the cavern, and he realized he could not linger much longer. He would have to return, to climb back into the world above, to decide what to do with the secret he now carried. But before he began the climb, he allowed himself one last moment. He closed his eyes, inhaled the thick, sweet air, and listened to the faint rustle of leaves in the hidden forest, the soft ripple of water on the underground lake, the distant cry of a creature unseen. He let it sink into him, a memory so vivid he knew it would stay for the rest of his life. Then, with reluctance that weighed like stone in his chest, Thomas clipped himself back onto the rope. He took one last look at the vast world below, at the forest that no human footsteps had ever disturbed, and whispered into the silence, "Stay hidden." The cavern gave no reply. Only the breath of air rose from the depths as he began his long, arduous climb back towards the surface, carrying with him the burden of the discovery and the impossible choice it demanded. Thomas Brooks clung to the rope, his body suspended above the vast cavern, his breath loud inside the helmet as his chest rose and fell with effort. For a moment he remained still, paralyzed between two worlds, the memory of the surface far above him and the impossible reality stretching beneath. His lamp traced faint arcs across the cavern walls, and each time the beam dipped low, he glimpsed again the glimmer of water, the swaying of grasses, the faint shimmer of leaves stirred by unseen currents. He knew he could not simply turn back without touching the ground, without feeling the soil of that secret forest beneath his boots. The thought of leaving without knowing more gnawed at him, stronger than fear, stronger than the fatigue in his aching muscles. With deliberate care he released more rope, lowering himself toward the cavern floor. The descent was slower now, cautious, his eyes straining in every direction as though he expected the darkness itself to stir. The humid air thickened as he sank further, clinging to his skin and fogging the edges of his vision. The smells grew richer too, layered and complex. Damp moss, wet earth, a faint tang of pollen. They were scents he associated with spring after rain, yet they were here, buried in the heart of the earth. At last his boots touched ground. The impact was soft, muffled by a carpet of moss that cushioned his landing. For a long moment he simply stood, unhooking himself from the rope, letting his weight sink fully onto his legs. He turned, slowly, sweeping the lamp across the clearing where he had landed, and what he saw stole the breath from his chest. The cavern floor was alive. The moss spread like a thick blanket, its surface shimmering faintly, each tiny leaf catching the glow of his lamp as though reflecting light of its own. Beyond the moss rose clusters of tall grass, stalks thicker than any he had seen in his fields, their tips crowned with plumes that quivered with the faintest draft. Further still, trees loomed, pale trunks stretching upward until they vanished into the darkness above, their branches heavy with broad leaves that glistened as if perpetually wet. It was a forest unlike any he had known, familiar in form, yet alien in its details, as though he had stepped not only into another place but another time. Thomas crouched and touched the moss with gloved fingers. It was damp and cool, resilient under pressure, and when he pressed harder it released a faint, earthy aroma. He scraped some into a container he had brought, instinctively collecting evidence, though he was already uncertain whether evidence was what the world should ever have of this place. He rose again, his eyes drawn to movement at the edge of the clearing. There, in the swaying grass, he saw animals. Their bodies were half hidden, but as they shifted he caught glimpses. A flank covered in short, dark fur, the glint of an eye reflecting his lamp, the outline of antlers branching wider than any deer he had ever seen. The creatures moved slowly, grazing with a calm rhythm, unconcerned by his presence, as though they had never known to fear man. His heart hammered as he realized he was looking at something thought long gone, survivors of a world lost to history. He lifted the camera, hands trembling, and recorded the scene. The lens captured the swaying of grass, the glint of antlers, the subtle movement of powerful bodies moving through the undergrowth. He whispered into the microphone, describing what he saw, though the words sounded weak compared to the enormity of the truth. He turned again and found more life. Insects with wings that shimmered like stained glass, drifting lazily in the humid air, birds perched high in the branches, their plumage iridescent in the lamplight. A reptile slithering across a stone, its scales glistening with moisture. Every corner of the cavern teemed with life, not the fragile scraps of survival he might have expected in such a place, but an entire ecosystem, robust and thriving. He walked slowly, reverently, as though afraid that each step might shatter the fragile balance. His boots pressed into the moss, leaving shallow imprints that filled with water almost instantly, the surface healing as though to erase his intrusion. He touched the bark of a tree, smooth and strangely warm beneath his glove, and looked upward into branches that twisted and crossed in a canopy that caught the mist and dripped with constant rain. He let a drop fall onto his hand, its coolness startling, its purity undeniable. The further he moved from the rope, the more he felt the weight of what he had stumbled upon. Here was a world preserved by the earth's secrecy, untouched by human greed or carelessness. No saw had cut these trees, no machines had scarred this ground, no hands had taken these animals for sport or profit. The silence was profound, yet it was not empty. It was the hum of life uninterrupted, the breath of a place that had endured without interference. Yet, even as awe swelled within him, dread crept in to match it. He imagined roads carved down into this cavern, concrete poured across the moss, fences erected around the animals. He imagined scientists swarming, cataloging, dissecting, pulling apart each leaf and bone until nothing remained of the wonder, only knowledge stripped of beauty. He imagined corporations sending men with machines, cutting, capturing, profiting. The vision was so vivid it made his stomach twist. He had seen what humans did to the surface world. How much more ruthless would they be with this hidden sanctuary? Thomas stopped walking and stood still, his lamp dimmed to a lower setting, listening. The forest rustled faintly, alive with unseen movement, and the water in the distance lapped gently at its unseen shore. A bird called, a long, haunting cry that echoed across the cavern, and somewhere in the distance a larger creature answered with a low, rumbling bellow. He felt like an intruder in a cathedral, humbled and ashamed, and for the first time he considered that perhaps discovery was not always a gift. Perhaps some secrets were meant to remain hidden, protected from the destructive curiosity of man. He filmed a few minutes more, recording the trees, the insects, the moss, the grasses, but his movements had grown slower, more hesitant, the camera lowering often as he allowed himself to simply see without capturing. The memory would be his, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had to be enough. Fatigue pressed down on him suddenly, the weight of his long descent and the strain of the moment catching up all at once. He realized he had been breathing harder than he should, the humid air heavy and damp, his oxygen supply limited. He turned reluctantly back toward the rope, its line vanishing into the darkness above, a reminder that his time here was not infinite. He walked slowly back across the moss, his boots leaving shallow impressions that filled and faded behind him, as though the earth itself wished to erase the trace of his presence. He stood once more at the base of the rope, looking out over the hidden world, and the enormity of his choice pressed against him. He had seen enough to understand. The question was no longer whether he could reveal it, but whether he should. He clipped himself back onto the harness, his lamp casting one final beam across the forest, and whispered a silent promise that whatever he decided, he would not forget what he had seen. Then he began to climb. Each pull upward was heavier than the last, not only from the strain in his arms and legs, but from the weight of the knowledge he carried. Below him the forest receded into shadow, the shimmering leaves fading, the moss and water swallowed by distance until only darkness remained. He climbed on, carrying the memory of the living world beneath, and with it the unbearable burden of knowing what mankind might do if it ever found its way here. The climb upward was agony. Thomas Brooks had not anticipated the sheer exhaustion that would gnaw at his muscles after everything he had endured. Each pull on the rope sent fire through his arms. Each brace of his boots against the stone sent pain crawling up his legs. His breath rasped against the inside of the mask, the hiss of oxygen punctuating every strained inhalation. The cavern below had already sunk into darkness, its forest and its creatures hidden once more by distance, yet he felt their presence pressing at the back of his mind. He was leaving behind a secret older than memory, and the weight of it clung to him as heavily as the gear strapped to his body. The rope swayed gently as he climbed, its creaks magnified in the silence, reminding him of how fragile his lifeline truly was. A slip, a cut, even the smallest flaw would mean a fall into endless black. Fear kept him focused. He fixed his eyes upward, toward the narrowing shaft, and counted each movement as though numbers could carry him closer to the surface. His shoulders ached, sweat soaked his clothes, and more than once he paused, dangling in the void, to calm the trembling of his arms before continuing. At last, after what felt like an eternity, his lamp caught the crumbling edge of earth where the shaft met the pasture. The sight gave him strength he did not know remained. With a final heave, he dragged himself over the lip, sprawling across the grass like a man reborn. He lay there for a long while, chest heaving, every muscle screaming, his eyes turned upward to the darkening sky. The air above felt thin and dry compared to the heavy breath of the cavern, yet it was blessedly clean, and he drank it in greedily. When he finally sat up, the world around him seemed almost unreal. The pasture stretched in familiar calm, the cows grazed in the distance, the evening breeze stirred the weeds, and the sky burned orange with the dying light of the sun. It was as though nothing had changed. Yet Thomas knew everything had changed. The hole behind him breathed faintly, carrying up its cool draft, and he felt as though it whispered to him, a reminder of what lay hidden beneath his very feet. He gathered his equipment with trembling hands, packed the ropes and the camera, and staggered back toward the farmhouse. Each step was heavy, his body threatening to collapse, but his mind was heavier still. He could not shake the images that played endlessly behind his eyes. The glowing moss, the trees stretching into shadow, the enormous wings of the bird as it vanished into darkness, the grazing animals with antlers like branches. He had proof, too, locked inside the camera case he carried at his side, though already the thought of revealing it sickened him. Inside the house, he set everything down and collapsed into the chair at the kitchen table. His letter still lay there under the jar, a ghostly reminder of how close he had come to vanishing into the earth forever. He stared at it, wondering whether he should tear it apart now that he had returned, but his hands were too heavy to move. Instead, he reached for the camera. With slow care, he switched it on, the screen glowing faintly in the dim room, and began to watch. The footage stole his breath all over again. The lens had captured everything: the cavern opening into vastness, the moss glowing faintly under the lamp, the first sight of the forest, the impossible creatures grazing without fear. His own voice trembled from the speaker as he described it all, disbelief raw in every word. He felt both pride and despair watching it. Pride because he had done what no one else had. Despair because the images were undeniable. If he released them, the world would come, and the world would ruin everything. He set the camera down and pressed his hands over his face. Exhaustion tugged at him, but his mind would not let him rest. He imagined scientists marching into the cavern with lights and drills, capturing the animals, uprooting plants for study, bottling water for analysis. He imagined governments claiming ownership, building roads and elevators to bring in tourists, selling tickets to witness what should never have been seen. He imagined corporations branding it, mining it, stripping it, until nothing remained but bones and stumps. He had seen it happen to forests on the surface, rivers poisoned by greed, mountains torn open for profit. If the world knew, the cavern would not last a decade. Yet, how could he keep such a secret? His discovery was larger than himself, larger than his life. The thought of dying with this knowledge, letting it rot in silence, seemed unbearable. He could picture his children, distant though they were, learning that their father had uncovered something that would change history, something hidden and miraculous, and he had kept it from them. He imagined the judgment of the world, of people who would call him selfish, a coward for refusing to share. The weight of the choice pressed against his chest until his breath grew shallow. He rose and paced the floor, the boards creaking beneath his boots. Again and again, he turned back to the camera, tempted to pack it, to drive into town, to show someone, anyone. But each time he imagined the flood that would follow, the destruction wrapped in the name of progress. His stomach turned with the certainty that humanity did not deserve the secret it had been denied for so long. He had looked into a place where time had not touched, where innocence remained, and he knew in his heart what mankind would do. They would ruin it, as they had ruined so much before. The night grew deep around him, and still he paced, torn in two by the burden of his discovery. He went to the window and looked out at the pasture, the dark shape of the hole just visible against the grass. It lay there, silent, patient, as though waiting for him to decide. He whispered aloud, his voice hoarse, "What am I supposed to do?" The night offered no answer. At last he returned to the table, sat heavily, and put his hands on the camera again. He scrolled through the footage one more time, each image cutting him anew. The glowing moss, the great bird, the ancient forest, it was all there, undeniable. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, not of joy, but of sorrow for what he now knew must come. When he shut the camera off, the room fell silent but for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The decision lingered there, unspoken, but it pressed against him with the inevitability of fate. He could not keep this forever. He could not reveal it either. Somewhere between the two lay his answer, but he had not yet found the courage to speak it aloud. And so Thomas Brooks sat in his farmhouse, his body broken from the descent, his mind burdened with the secret of the living world below. Dawn would come soon, and with it the weight of choice would grow heavier still. He did not yet know what he would do, but he understood one thing with painful clarity. The fate of a place untouched by man now rested in his hands alone. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains and painted the walls of the farmhouse in a pale gray glow. Thomas Brooks sat slumped at the kitchen table, his eyes red with fatigue, his body aching from the ordeal of his descent and climb. He had not slept. He had not even moved for hours, except to pour himself water that went untouched on the table beside him. Before him lay the camera, its dark screen reflecting his worn face and the folded letter he had written before the descent. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house and the distant lowing of cattle out in the pasture. He knew the moment had come. He had to decide. The images he had recorded haunted him. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw the moss shimmering faintly in the light, the towering trunks of pale trees reaching into shadow, the sweep of wings as the bird took flight. He heard again the low rumbling call of some creature in the distance, the sound of a world alive in its own hidden rhythm. It was no dream. It was real. The proof sat within the camera, ready to expose the secret to anyone who cared to see. That knowledge gave him no comfort, only dread. He thought of what would follow if he revealed it. He could see it clearly, the way his mind had been turning the vision over and over throughout the long night. A headline would announce it first: "Farmer discovers hidden world beneath his land." News trucks would swarm his pasture, people with microphones and cameras crowding the fields where only cows had ever grazed. Experts would arrive with their measuring instruments, politicians with their speeches, businessmen with their contracts. The quiet hole in the earth would become the entrance to a spectacle. And beyond that, when the frenzy settled into something permanent, the real destruction would begin. Machines would bore wider tunnels, roads would be built, elevators installed, scientists would capture the animals, cut open their bodies in sterile labs, and catalog them in textbooks stripped of wonder. The trees would be felled for study, the moss scraped away, the lake drained and tested. Tourists would flood the forest, trampling it with careless feet, leaving trash behind in a place that had never known the stench of plastic or smoke. What had survived for millennia would be undone in years. Thomas pressed his hands against his face, groaning. He thought of his children, far away in cities, strangers to the land that had shaped him. If he shared the discovery, his name would be remembered. They would know their father had done something extraordinary, that he had revealed a secret hidden from humanity since time began. They might even profit from it if the land became valuable, if governments or corporations paid him for rights. But the thought tasted like ash. What good was legacy if it came at the cost of destroying something far greater? What good was pride when measured against the end of an untouched world? The clock ticked on the wall, marking the slow passage of morning. Sunlight crept higher across the table, illuminating the camera, the letter, his calloused hands. He knew then what he had to do, though the choice tore at him like claws. He reached for the camera with a steadiness that surprised him, as though his body had made the decision before his mind. He switched it on one last time, watching the screen flicker to life, and played through the images. He forced himself to look, to let the beauty burn itself into his memory. The moss, the trees, the creatures, it all glowed on the small screen, a fragile echo of the real thing. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, "I'm sorry." With trembling hands, he deleted the footage. Each press of a button felt like cutting out a part of himself, but he continued methodical, relentless. The files disappeared one by one until the screen went blank. He powered it off and set it aside, his chest hollow, his breath shallow. Then, before he could lose his resolve, he lifted the camera high and brought it crashing down against the stone floor. The casing cracked, the lens shattered, pieces scattering across the wood. He struck it again and again until nothing recognizable remained, until it was nothing more than a ruin of plastic and glass. The evidence was gone, erased forever. He sat back heavily, staring at the fragments. A wave of despair swept over him, followed quickly by a strange peace. The burden of choice had been crushing him, but now it was done. The secret would remain. The cavern would live on in silence, unspoiled, unseen. Humanity would never have the chance to ruin it. He had sacrificed recognition, sacrificed the chance to be remembered, but in doing so he had saved something far more important. When the sun climbed higher, he left the house and walked back to the pasture. The cows grazed as always, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the mind of the man who owned them. The hole lay ahead, dark and patient, its edges ringed by weeds and roots. Thomas stood at the rim and looked down into its silent throat. For the first time since he had discovered it, he did not feel pulled, did not feel haunted by questions. He felt only a solemn responsibility. He picked up the shovel he had brought and began to work. The labor was grueling, the sun climbing higher, sweat soaking his shirt, dirt clinging to his skin. He moved stone after stone, shovel after shovel of earth, piling it into the hole. Hours passed, his muscles screaming, his back aching, but he did not stop. He worked until the shadows lengthened and the air cooled again, until the hole was no longer a gaping mouth but a mound of soil and rock, sealed as best as one man could seal it. He stood over it, chest heaving, staring at the ground that now looked like any other patch of earth in the pasture. The draft of cool air no longer touched his face. The forest, the lake, the creatures were safe once more, hidden away. As dusk fell, Thomas remained at the spot, leaning on his shovel, the sky burning red and gold above him. The cows drifted lazily nearby, the ordinary world resuming as though nothing had changed. But he knew better. Everything had changed. He had seen a world untouched by man, a sanctuary preserved by secrecy, and he had chosen to keep it that way. No one would ever believe him if he tried to tell the story now, and that was as it should be. He walked slowly back to the farmhouse, his body aching, his heart heavy but resolute. The letter still lay on the table when he returned, but he no longer needed it. He picked it up, tore it into pieces, and let them fall into the stove, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames. The secret was his alone now, carried in memory, safeguarded by silence. That night, he stepped outside before bed, standing under the vast dome of stars. He thought of the forest hidden beneath him, of the creatures roaming free in eternal twilight, of the moss and trees breathing the same air in their secret world. He whispered into the night, as though speaking to them across the barrier of stone and earth, "Stay alive, stay hidden. No reply came, only the soft rustle of wind in the grass, the low murmur of the cattle, the eternal silence of the land. Thomas Brooks turned and went inside, closing the door behind him, knowing he had made the hardest choice of his life. He would live with it in quiet solitude, the world above unchanged, the world below unspoiled. Some secrets were too sacred for man to claim, and he had learned that the greatest act of discovery could sometimes be the decision to let it remain unknown. And so the hidden world endured, untouched by the hands of man, safe in its silence beneath the earth. Only one man knew, and he had chosen to guard it with the weight of his own silence. The land had offered him its secret, and he had returned the only gift worthy of it: protection through forgetting. Don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next shocking story. Click on one of these videos right now for more unbelievable discoveries you won't believe are real. And if this story left you speechless, share it with your friends. Let them feel the same chills you did.